Hi, Devin. I am going to read to you now from Been in the Storm So Long by your request. So, we have been reading about the coming of the end of the Civil War and the impending end of slavery as an institution. And where we last were reading, it talks about how some of the slaves, when they first encountered the Union Army, would free themselves, but then sometimes drift back to the routines of the plantations and farms from which they had fled. So things are complex. I'm going to pick up where we left off. After what many planters had experienced, and I'll let you know this is Chapter 3, Section 6 of Leon Litwack's Been in the Storm So Long. And for people who are listening who are unfamiliar with this, this draws on original quotations and sometimes some language that I would not want to use is used, so I will refer to the N word when that comes up. These are quotes from people in the South during the Civil War. So the language, what was acceptable at that time, well, not really, but is much more commonplace than it would be today. After what many planters had experienced, the number of slave defections seemed less important than the behavior of those who remained. More often than most whites wished to believe or concede publicly, the quote demoralization, as they preferred to call it, of the slave population took a violent and destructive bent. The victims of such depredations took little comfort in the ready explanation that these were exceptional cases, nor was their anguish necessarily mitigated by the popular view that only the Yankees could have instigated the blacks to behave so outrageously. If only the slaves had been left alone, Henry W. Ravenel kept telling himself, they would have obeyed their natural instincts and remained, quote, a quiet and contented and happy people. But Ravenel, a native of South Carolina, should have known better. The sacking of nearby Beaufort early in the war illustrated the capacity of the slaves for destructive activity in the days preceding the arrival of Union troops. Local planters had already set an example by trying to burn down the cotton barns before their hasty departure. If slaves in the Sea Islands region usually refrained from destroying the plantation on which they had lived, the many who poured into Beaufort had little compunction, that's reluctance, about occupying and ransacking the stately townhouses of well-to-do planters. When one planter momentarily returned to his home, he found a slave seated at the piano, playing away like the very devil, end quote, and two young black women upstairs, quote, dancing away famously, end quote. He also discovered that many neighboring houses had been completely turned upside down and inside out. And that's a quote, completely turned upside down and inside out, end quote. And the local churches had been vandalized. When a Union landing party finally came ashore, they were startled by the extent of the devastation. We went through spacious houses where only a week ago families were living in luxury and saw their costly furniture despoiled, books and papers smashed, pianos on the sidewalk, feather beds ripped open, and even the filth of the Negroes left lying in parlors and bedchambers. That's an end of the quote. Much of the destruction, one reporter suggested, could not be defined as, quote, plunder, end quote, but only as, quote, malicious love of mischief gratified, end quote. When news of the sacking reached the North, Henry M. Turner, an outspoken black clergyman, was equally startled. In fact, he refused to believe the, quote, ridiculous, outrageous, and cannibalistic reports of slave excesses. Having been a resident of South Carolina for more than 20 years of his life, he could attest to the fact that, quote, there are no class of colored people in South south of Mason and Dixon line, where more sound sense, morality, religion, and refined taste prevails than in Beaufort." End quote. The slaves themselves said little about the fury they had unleashed on some of the more imposing symbols of the slaveholding aristocracy, nor did they apparently deem an explanation necessary. Although the extent of slave pillaging in the South was sometimes exaggerated or confused with Yankee depredations, that any should have occurred aroused consternation. Quote, "The Moorfield Negroes are crazy quite," a South Carolinian wrote. Continuing the quote, "They have been to Pinopolis helping in the sacking of the houses," end quote. In some areas, the slaves singled out the most popular summer retreats for wealthy planters, where the quality of the furnishing provided sufficient temptation. Where white families had abandoned their homes, the slaves, for instance, in many instances, preferred occupation to pillage, moving from their own cramped quarters into the much more commodious and comfortable lodgings, which they had previously envied from a distance. The slaves who flocked into the towns from the outlying plantations, seeking the protection of federal authority and a more congenial atmosphere in which to spend their first days of freedom, found an instant answer to their housing problem by occupying the elegant townhouses of absent owners. To sleep in the master's bed and eat at the dining room table with family silver and china was a novel and exhilarating experience. Quote, "Mama's house is occupied by freed men, cooking in every room," end quote, reported a South Carolina woman who had only recently heard from a friend in a nearby town that, quote, "all the houses around them are occupied by Negroes," end quote. Already in shock over the apparent collapse of the social order, native whites now listened to reports that slaves were using the baronial townhouses to give, quote, "Negro balls," end quote, and dinner parties. Quote, "The whites, presumably Yankees, and blacks danced together," end quote. A friend wrote Adele Alston of a recent ball in Georgetown, South Carolina. Where would it all end? The events of the past several weeks, Henry W. Ravenel confided in his diary, reminded him of the horrors of the French Revolution. Quote, "White man is inward, and the inward is white man," was the way another South Carolinian chose to describe the state of things. Whether in the towns or in the countryside, the welcome accorded the Union troops by many slaves had not been confined to prayers and singing, but had included as well the expropriation of nearly everything belonging to their masters and mistresses that could be moved. With a feeling of utter helplessness, Amanda Stone's family, after abandoning the family home in Louisiana, heard how the slaves had quarreled over the division of clothes and how the house had been stripped of furniture, carpets, books, the piano, quote, and everything else. Nor did the presence of the white family necessarily restrain the slaves. Quote, "The Negroes, as soon as they heard the guns," a rice planter in South Carolina reported, "rushed to my house and pillaged it of many things, and principally wearing apparel." He felt certain that the entire affair had been prearranged. For the masters, what proved most difficult to accept was the gratification of some slaves derived from these attacks on property. Many of them, John H. Bills thought, quote, "do all they can to have us destroyed and delight in seeing the work of destruction," end quote. Upon returning to their plantation home, the Alston family suddenly understood the overseer's report that their slaves had quote, "behaved very badly." Quote, "We looked at the house. It was a wreck. The front steps gone, not a door nor shutter left, and not a sash. They had torn out all the mahogany framework around the doors and windows. There were mahogany panels below the windows and above the doors There were mahogany panels below the windows and above the doors. There were panels painted. The mahogany banister to to the staircase going upstairs, everything that could be torn away was gone. It was a scene of destruction in Papa's study, where he kept all his accounts and papers, as he had done from the time he began planting as a young man, was almost waist-deep in torn letters and papers." End quote. The systematic nature of much of the black pillaging suggested that it was frequently neither indiscriminate nor simply a matter of gratified revenge, but rather an opportunity to supplement their meager diets and wardrobes and improve their standard of living. Why they killed the livestock, emptied the meat houses and storerooms, and expropriated the liquors and wines would seem sufficiently obvious. The furniture and materials removed from the big house were often used to make their own cabins more habitable. One South Carolina slave explained that after the master departed, they stripped boards from his house in order to floor their own cabins and put in lofts. Similarly, when the slaves broke into closets, bureaus, trunks, and desks, ripped open the bedding, or scattered the master's private papers, they were frequently seeking money, jewelry, or silverware that might be traded for needed commodities. When the slaves seized the mules, horses, and wagons, it was often with the idea of making their escape from the plantation, taking with them whatever the carts could carry. On A.F. Pugh's plantation, an enterprising former slave accumulated a cartload of articles from several neighboring plantations and bartered them with other blacks in the vicinity. The overseer was powerless to stop this apparently flourishing business based on loot. What the whites defined as theft might be viewed by the slaves as long overdue payments for past services. Adele Alston conceded almost as much when she wrote her son about the destruction visited upon their Chicora Wood plantation. Quote, "The conduct of the Negroes in robbing our house, storeroom, meat house, etc., and refusing to restore anything shows you they think it right to steal from us, to spoil us, as the Israelites did the Egyptians." End quote. For historical context, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. The slaves simply suggested that the question of theft be placed in its proper perspective, like the old Gullah preacher who asked his congregation, quote, "If Buckra never thief, how come inward yer?" I'm actually not sure what that quote is saying, because it is put in very strong vernacular. If Buckra never thief, I assume that's thief or steal, how come inward yer? I don't know what that is saying. I'm sorry. That the constraints of slave life had made thieves of them, some slaves readily conceded, although always stressing that the conditions that had made this necessary. "We work so hard and get nothing for our labor, but just our allowance we obliged to steal. End quote. A South Carolina slave explained in 1863, "And then we must keep them everything, and they suffer us too much. But they take all our labor and steal our children, and we only take their chicken." End quote. To attempt to reason with a slave on this sensitive matter could be an exasperating, if sometimes illuminating experience for a white. In Tennessee, a slave rode into a Union camp on a horse he had taken from his owner. Upon being questioned, presumably by a Union soldier or reporter, the slave insisted only that the usual notions of morality had little relevance to his action. Quote, "Don't you think you did very wrong, Dick, to take your mistress's horse?" "Well, I do know, sir. I didn't take the best one. She had 3, 2 of them first-rate horses. But one I took is old and not very fast, and I offered to sell him for $8, sir." "But, Dick, you took at least $1,000 from your mistress besides the horse." "How, sir?" "Why, you were worth $1,000, and you should have been satisfied with that much without taking the poor woman's horse," said I gravely. The contraband scratched his woolly head, rolled up his eyes at me, and replied with emphasis, "I don't look at it just that way, massa. I I worked hard for Mrs. more'n 30 years, and I reckon in that time I about pay for myself. And this year, Mrs. give me leave to raise a patch of baccy for my own. I assume that's tobacco. Well, I worked nights and Sabbaths and spare times, and raised a big patch. Why, prices is worth $200, I reckon, of tobacco. And when I got it tooken care of this fall, old Missus took it away from me. Give some to the neighbors, keep some for herself, for her own use, and sell some. And keep the money, and I reckon that pay for the old horse. Failing to find any conscience in the, quote, darky, I gave up the argument, end quote. I think this former slave has a point. Even where slaves refrained from expropriating or destroying property, they often behaved in ways that troubled and infuriated their masters and mistresses. The decision of a slave to remain on the plantation was no guarantee of his fidelity or steady labor. The Reverend Samuel A. Agnew, a Mississippi slaveholder, understood that all too well. Some of our Negroes will not go to the Yankees, he thought, but they may all prove faithless, end quote. For many slave owners, as for Agnew, the ability to retain the bulk of their blacks proved to be no cause for self-congratulation. Despite the concern voiced over the stampede of the slaves, some white families might have found reasons to be grateful, if only because they avoided the anguish experienced by so many of their neighbors. Quote, "Oh, deliver me from the citizens of African descent. I am disgusted forever with the whole race. I have not faith in one single dark individual. They are all alike ungrateful and treacherous. Every servant is a spy upon us, and everything we do is reported to the Yankees. They know everything." End quote. And that is the end of section 6. I'll read more later. I love you, Devin. Good night. Sleep well.